Angela White with the Daily London News. Today is July 29th, 2012. Before we delve into the abusive world of Victorian London, I would like to introduce you to the newest member of our newscast team, Jessica Black.
What's delve mean?
Let's delve back into old world Victorian London. Our first topic is education. We were also extremely privileged to have a world-renowned historian, a professor from Oxford, to be Skyped in with us, Miss Rebecca Roberts.
Let's get the show on the road.
Good Lord.
You two related?
Yes.
No.
Right, it's a pleasure to have you. So what can you tell us about the struggles of the educational system?
Well, according to the Victorian School Committee, although there is evidence that schools existed back in the 6th century, most schools were only for the extremely privileged children. In fact, children of the rich and wealthy upper classes might have had a governess to teach them when they were younger, and then, as they got older, the boys would move on to schools such as rugby, while the girls remained homeschooled.
And remember, this is a time when women were considered less important than men. There was a huge gender gap.
That's correct. The Victorian School Committee also states usually classes had a very expansive age range, and even though younger students were taught in the same classes, genders would sit apart. Girls and boys would even use different entrances and their own playgrounds. Moving on, as James Kay, the famous British politician and educationist, states,
As far as I have observed, generally, or the common day school in large towns in the north or elsewhere, it appears to me that the whole system is defective in respect. That is supposed that education will be best promoted by coercing, that knowledge in itself is repulsive, and that it requires coercive treatment to make a child acquire even the simplest elements of knowledge. And as far as respects kindness in the treatment of children, I think the great majority of such schoolmasters would conceive that they deserted their duty if they treated the children kindly.
Interesting. What's rugby?
well, rugby in this case was an all-boys school, and it is also believed to be where rugby was first played and invented, thus the name.
You know, I've never seen rugby.
You can watch it on the Olympics.
I guess I really have no experience with it.
She's American.
That explains a bit. Anyway, yes, it was very common, not to mention that the students were afraid of their teachers. Believe it or not, David Copperfield was excited to go to school, but once he got there, he found a placard on his desk saying, "Take care of him. He bites." The teacher wasn't referring to a dog or an animal, but him.
Well, as some might have heard, was it true that some of the classes back in Victorian London have 300 students in them?
Also ask any historian, and they would all say the teachers were extremely abusive, whether that was physical abuse or verbal. For example, "You, John, are the West Boyne School. Everybody knows it, and I'm sure you will come to no good," quoted a teacher. Also, a school inspector, the Rev. Allen, recalls one of these private schools. "I was directed to a room in the rear of a shop, about 10 feet by 12, in which, with my hat on, I could barely stand upright. The floor was crowded with benches, on which some dozen children were sitting in ranks closely packed, many without any means of employing their time. Teachers thought that all children were not too rebellious if they got a punishment. Left-handed kids were punished and they had to learn how to be right-handed."
How awful.
Definitely. Schools like the ones you're referring to were extremely grim places. Most had high windows so the students could not see out, and they were very plain, with maybe a stone lesson on the wall. Buildings rotted since managers didn't want to spend any money, according to historian and author Patrick Rook.
Wow.
I've heard that some of these schools were also themselves extremely foreboding.
Geez, it's like they couldn't find better staff members.
Actually, the Rev. Allen reports in the minutes of the Committee of Council on Education of the difficulty of recruiting teachers. Teaching usually consisted of the teachers writing on a blackboard, and then the lesson being recorded into books and being learned. Most of the teaching was repetition and memorizing and reciting the times tables and such. Teaching was also usually a job for unmarried women, which is why they were called Miss, and by our standards today, they were extremely formidable and
So
strict.
were all schools like that?
Well, as much as there were worse-off schools, there were some schools that were much better. We've heard from a journal, one girl, Rosebud, saying that she enjoyed her school. Her principal, Miss Twinkleton, was gentle and kind-hearted. Her teachers understood her, and they helped her when she didn't get some of her subjects. When she studied back in the 1800s, these girls would go to these schools and then later become governesses in rich homes. Yes, I'm sure Rosa learned all of those things.
I've heard that the basic lessons in the Victorian era were usually concentrated around the 3 R's: reading and writing, reckoning and figuring, rotting and writing. It's nice to find there was some hope for the Victorian era. I'm guessing these nicknames were because of the conditions of the poor class students. So then all children got education?
Talk about loving parents.
I know, right?
I just pity those poor children who had to endure before these schools were built, who had to endure the punishment of the ruthless teachers. For one thing, if children would read books, one had to last the whole year, you know. They had to read it again and again. There was even a punishment book for children. Boys were caned across their backs and girls across their hands and legs. The little choices these children were made was that they got to choose which cane they got beaten with. Some children had to wear a dunce's cap, and there was absolutely no understanding that children had learning difficulties or were slower at absorbing the information. Reasons why kids were punished: poor work, speaking out of turn, answering back, being rude, actually anything that displeased the teachers. Teachers kept their canes in water so they would hurt more. Other punishments were detentions and usually writing lines over and over. The punishment also went in a punishment book or log. I mean, it's just horrific that someone could do that. Can you imagine nowadays that parents and teachers let their kids be abused and be dragged through hell and back?
History.
Wow, she seems to know a lot about this stuff.
Has a kid.
Right.
History major.
Okay, next in the London Victorian news, we're going to be talking about a horrifying monster that used to be terrorizing victims all over England, but was never caught. A victim described him as thin and was wearing a black helmet and devil's horns and breathed blue fire. He apparently dove at her with the claws on the tips of his ghostly white fingertips.
He survived, right?
I thought you said you knew about Springfield Jack.
I thought you said spring rolls because there's this guy. I'll be quiet right now.
Well, then according to Professors Stephanie P. Ryder, Springfield Jack never caused any permanent damage, and he didn't this time, although we're pretty sure he'll strike again.
Oh wait, he wasn't caught, seriously? I mean, you'd think the police could do better. That to keep their citizens safe.
We're getting off topic now. Back to Springfield Jack. Read your background information sheet next time. As Professor Leanne Perry states, Springfield Jack started attacking people in 1838 when he attacked a woman named Miss Polly Adams. A servant girl named Mary Stevens saw it and reported the attack. Read this.
She also says Springfield Jack's first attack in the paper was of Lucy Scales when she was attacked later in 1838. This is a wanted poster that was put up after the...
Whatever. The police sent out extra patrols, but he was never caught. Some say he was Henry de la Poer Beresford, Marquis of Waterford, an eccentric Irish nobleman who, before he went mad, was a prankster. Others think that it was just some children.
That was all, but now on to the Olympic updates. Guess who just won gold in swimming? America.
Mrs. Alsop, what happened that night?
I heard my sister screaming. I ran down the stairs, and I found Jane screaming and Lily crying in the corner. So I ran towards them, and the next thing I knew, I had to yank Jane away from that monster and slam the door in his face.
I was a prankster. Others think that it was just some children.
That was all, but now on to the Olympic updates.
Well, right now the European Rugby Cup is continuing on, and England seems to have the upper hand against New Zealand, the current European Rugby Cup champions. Centre Richard Kahui is out for the game with a broken leg, while England charges on.
Guess who just won gold in swimming? America.
That's all for Come to Carolyn Costumier's Brothers Victorian Dresses, where you can get historically accurate Victorian gowns and corsets. Also come now and we'll include a free hoop skirt and bonnet. Carolyn Costumier's Brothers Victorian Dresses. Be transported back in time.